said, my name is Christopher Martin. I'm on the executive committee of the Urban Design Group, and I'm also director of urban strategy at Urban Movement. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on Glasgow and telling the regeneration story of the city from a myriad of different angles and perspectives. And to chat this through, we've got a really exciting panel lined up to introduce and discuss some ideas. And I'm really grateful for them joining tonight on this, what is in London at least, an absolute scorcher of an evening. First up will be Niall Murphy of Glasgow City Heritage Trust. He's going to sort of bring to life some of the history of the Dear Green Place. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over first now to Niall to kick off. And just a reminder to please put all questions and thoughts in the chat. Niall, please take it away.
Okay, right. The evolution of Glasgow, a wee primer on the evolution of Glasgow for everyone, just in case people don't know Glasgow at all. So essentially what I'm trying to do in 10 minutes is compress over 1,000 years of history as quickly as I can. So in essence, Glasgow was established in the 6th century, and this is Roy's military map of Glasgow. So this was done just after the Jacobite Rebellion. So it gives you an idea of what the scale of the city was at. So it was a very small settlement still at that point. You're probably talking 20 to 30,000 people living in the city at that point. And the way that Glasgow originally worked, it's a dumbbell on plan. So you've got a node around the cathedral, which sits towards the top of the screen. So you've got a node there, and then you've got another node down the bottom, which is Glasgow Cross and the Tron. And that was where it was easiest for the fishermen to get access to the Clyde to fish. And so the high street developed as a spine between the two of them and took 500 years to develop. So, and we'll continue on from how the city developed thereafter. And unlike, say, with Edinburgh, where you had the Norloch between the old town and the new town, because of the geography of Glasgow, Glasgow could extend away from that medieval spine of the city. But what's interesting when you look at plans like this, and what's interesting about this is because you realize that at this point, and this is after obviously the union of England and Scotland. And on the back of that, you get serious growth happening in Glasgow because suddenly it's got the merchants in Glasgow have access to the eastern seaboard of America and the early colonies there. And they have like a 6-week competitive advantage over their rivals in London. And so what they end up doing is they secured the tobacco trade. They get the monopoly for the tobacco trade in Europe for places like France, for instance, because they turn the city into an entry port for that. And what is particularly fascinating about this is because of how they operated, their economic system and how they operated meant that the apprentices for the tobacco lords had to actually base themselves in the early colonies in America. And so they knew the whole eastern seaboard, they knew the Caribbean as well. So they were aware of all the early developments in kind of urban design at that time. And they actually re-imported those developments back into Scotland. And so where you get Glasgow's grid, and Glasgow is obviously very unusual in the United Kingdom in having a grid, so it makes it kind of the least British of the British cities. That's actually a re-import back from the United States. So, and you can see how the grid is appearing here. So that's James Barry's plan for the second new town in Glasgow. And that basically, Glaswegians always tried to reinvent their city. So there are various kind of big urban interventions. We'll come across that as we go through this. And this was a major one, extending the city away from the medieval spine of the city. And you get a square in the center of it, which is modeled on the squares in London. So that's George Square, with the aim being to have a square that was like the West End squares in London and also like the squares in Edinburgh as well. So, and this is at the start of the kind of explosive growth. So this is the era of Adam Smith, the economist who was based at Glasgow University and wrote the majority of, and did research for the majority of his wealth of nations, in Glasgow, because he was actually, talking to the tobacco lords. So he understood how their economic system worked. So that leads to massive explosive growth throughout the 19th century. So the city really begins to take off. It overtakes Edinburgh as the largest city in Scotland, and just keeps on going thereafter. So this is as a fantastic view of the city taken from a balloon over the south side. This is by Thomas Sulman, who did these illustrations for the Illustrated London News. So this is what the city was like in 1864. So enormous growth by this point. But the consequence of this explosive city growth is you get issues that begin to emerge. poverty in particular, urban health, major issues in Glasgow, and it's something that is still very much with us. And this is all manifested, and this was something that came about. The Glasgow City Improvement Trust, a major innovation that Glasgow did. The first time that any city in the United Kingdom had sent a delegation around Europe to study what the Europeans were up to in terms of reforming their cities. So they did a tour. This was led by John Carrick, the city architect in Glasgow. They did a tour around Europe, took the Lord Provost, Blackie, with them, and Dr. William Gardner, who was the first medical officer for the city, so he was in charge of the city's health. They did a tour. Their last stop was Paris, and they were blown away by what Baron Haussmann was doing in Paris. And so they brought those ideas back to Glasgow. But one of the innovations that they did as part of the Glasgow City Improvement Trust was they got the photographer, Thomas Annan, to sit and record what the old city was like, so all the wines of the old city, and to show how bad the overcrowding was. And this had been something that had been with the city for decades. So, for instance, you have this fantastic quote here from Frederick Engels, Conditions of the Working Class in England. So this is from a parliamentary debate in 1838, which tells you exactly what the city was like at the time, about the amount of filth and dirt, and the smell must have been appalling when you think that Thomas Allen would have had to go into these unventilated, poor sanitized conditions in order to take those photographs, and the time it would have taken him to take those photographs as well. It must have been quite a task. So these kind of the Ordnance Survey maps of the city at the time are particularly fascinating because they show the impact the City Improvement Trust had on the city. And it was hugely influential. So you've got parliamentarians, Octavia Hill, for instance, she brought parliamentarians up from London to see what Glasgow was up to see what the English cities could do to kind of improve their lot based on what Glasgow was up to. So that's the city in 1855, and the heart of the city over what is Glasgow Cross. So it gives you an idea of how dense and kind of organic the growth of the city was at that time. Zoom forward to 1892, the whole city is gradually getting simplified out as the City Improvement Trust is building new roads, reorganizing whole sections of the city. You've got this whole area here, which is completely under review. They had hoped the developers would buy these kind of brownfield sites. Didn't happen like that. They ended up having to develop them themselves. And that's the city by 1910. So huge growth still, but it's much more regulated, much more thought through. And John Carrick was a real visionary in those kind of terms and a modernist. And so that is why you end up with what is roughly kind of the second city of the empire. So this is 1905, Thomas Annan again, taking a panorama from, this is Glasgow University moved wholesale to the west end of the city because cholera had jumped the walls into the old university complex. That was considered unacceptable. And so they ended up moving. They got a really good deal from the railway operators, and they ended up moving out to the west end of the city instead. So that shows the view across Kelvin Grove Park, which was set out by Joseph Paxton. And it shows you Park Circus, which is one of the glories of Victorian urban planning in the UK. So, and this gives you an idea of just how dense the city was by the interwar period. So it was the UK's other million plus city. So by 1925, its population had peaked about 1.1 million. Obviously, there's not a census in the Second World War, but it probably got slightly larger than that. But it was a hugely dense city. So it's the most densely populated city in the north of Europe. So operating at twice the density of London. Now that was considered a major deal. So that was something that was considered a real problem, and it was something that had to be addressed because the urban conditions in Glasgow were extremely poor. Part of the reason for that is that we have tenements in Glasgow. The tenements range right across all the kind of social classes. But because of how tenements operated, they were for rent. And during the First World War, when rent controls were put in place after a rent strike in Glasgow, which was for a worthwhile cause because the landlords were upping the rents at the time, that destroyed what's called the factoring profession in Glasgow, which was to look after and maintain the tenements. So after the First World War, the tenements did not get properly maintained at all. It was just abandoned. And by the time you're in the post-war period after the Second World War, you're talking about 3-4 decades of no maintenance at all. The buildings are beginning to fall apart. It's a serious issue because of the overcrowding at the same time. So something had to be done. And what the Glaswegians did, everybody was instructed, all of the major cities in the UK were instructed to come up with a plan for their city after the Second World War. Glasgow's was the shortest. It was ran to about 27 sides of A4, and this was the Bruce Plan. And basically the Bruce Plan was to demolish the entire city centre of the city, start again with a ring road around it. And there were rival plans too. You've also got Sir Patrick Abercrombie's Clyde Regional Plan, which was for taking the kind of the density of Glasgow and spreading it out in a series of overspill new towns around the city as well. So you've got these two rival plans competing with each other. And there was also tax incentives. There was a scheme called Skimming the Cream off Glasgow, where tax incentives were offered to the brightest and best to move to those new towns. So it was leaving a core within the city of poorer people, less able people who were stuck in the city, which obviously caused health issues. So, and there was this whole vision of turning Glasgow into a kind of LA of the future, even though Glasgow had the lowest number of cars per head of population of any European city at this point. This was their vision. They went to the south of France to see what Corbusier was up to in the Unité de Habitation. And they also sent delegations to Los Angeles and to Pittsburgh to study what the freeways were there. And they managed to get a team from LA as well, who would map out what the highways were to look like around Glasgow. So this was this whole new kind of vision of the future, great leap forward. And combined with that, there was a series of comprehensive development areas created around the city as well. So effectively, 40% of the Victorian city was demolished to make way for a new city. So it had an enormous impact on the city, a real dislocation of the city. Whole areas just completely wiped out. So on the back of that as well, you get a whole kind of Jane Jacobs scenario going on as well, where you've got cataclysmic, what she calls cataclysmic money, where there's an awful lot of money spent on a problem at once. But at the same time, you've also got what she would refer to as redlining happening, where whole areas, because they're created comprehensive development areas, no investment goes into them. So the whole fabric is beginning to fall apart. All that was documented by this photographer, Nick Hedges, for Shelter in the early 1970s. You can see just how appalling the urban conditions were at that point. And the poverty was by far the worst in the UK by this point. So, and what's interesting as well is you see modernity sweeping over the city, and how the grids, this is a view of the Gorbals and Hutchison Town and the Gorbals, and how the grids of tenements, which were really well laid out and well built, but didn't have the facilities, no inside toilets, things like that, were swept away, and modernity in these new housing estates, so that's Basil Spencer's Queen Elizabeth Square, you can see in the foreground there, are gradually being imposed on what was formerly a grid. But it didn't work. The scheme comprehensively failed, in particular with Basil Spencer's project. That became an election issue in the 1980s. And even though an enormous amount of money was spent trying to retrofit the building to get it to work, it was referred to as the dampies. There was so much dirt and damp. And the housing conditions in there, they were impossible to live with. It was one huge cold bridge. And so it ended up being demolished in 1993. So that was seen as the kind of the failure of the whole comprehensive development area program. And the city had to reinvent itself. But at the same time, what you get is people who were trapped in the tenements, who realized that they were going to be stuck there for many decades still because the kind of renewal program was going to take so long to reach them. They decided to do something about their conditions. So you get the first instance of this is what was called Annie's Loo, which the Lord Provost at the time actually came to open up Annie's Loo. And Annie Gibbon, who was with Raymond Young, was the instigator of this. And this was how they reorganized the flats inside the tenements, because they realized that these flats that did not have any kind of toilet within them, you could do that if you just reconfigured them slightly. So Annie Gibbons referred to it as the best 190 quid she ever spent, because she finally had an inside toilet. And that made people think, well, hold on a minute, we could actually rehabilitate the tenements rather than bulldoze them. And that gave rise to Scotland's local housing association movement, which is still going strong today. So that was a major initiative. And Scotland's housing association movement has actually become the kind of, they're at the forefront of design now. They're commissioning some of the best new social housing in not just Scotland, but the UK as well. So this is New Gorbals Housing Association, Cran Street in the Gorbals, a tenement by Elder and Cannon, which is attached onto the side of their offices by Page and Park Architects. And it gives you an idea of what they're capable of and how contemporary the design is. These are really good flats. So, but nevertheless, the legacy of the CDA has left the city with kind of brownfield sites, dereliction, poor health outcomes, by the 1980s and the 1980 recession, things were so bad, the city's population had, from a peak of 1.1, fell, it was intended to fall to about 750,000. In fact, fell to about 570,000, so way overshot. And you've got kind of, it's risen back up again to about 625,000 at the moment. So, but effectively, you've got half the population of what should have been in the city have kind of disappeared. So we're all rattling around in a city that's, capable of accommodating a lot more, and densities have plummeted as well. So there's lots we have to do about that. And that's something in particular Glasgow City Heritage Trust are trying to focus on. So we are focused on things like vacancy in the city centre, how to get kind of buildings at risk back into use, how to get the population back up in the city centre. We don't have an awful lot of money to deal with that with. We have a budget of about £1 million a year, but we try and use that to leverage in and to help developers get people back into the city, and also to improve the condition of the buildings within the city. So just to wind the whole thing up, if people are interested in how Glasgow developed and how it's continuing to develop, these are the kind of key books, the key texts that you should read on it. So The Tobacco Lords by Sir Tom Devine, the great Scottish historian at the moment. Tenement as a Way of Life, which tells you all about how the tenement actually operated. Peter Reid's book on Glasgow, The Forming of the City, which is absolutely superb. And then finally, The Upper Tree, which is all about the kind of the industry in Glasgow and how industry effectively poisoned the city. And that's still a major issue nowadays, and is one of the things behind the Glasgow effect, particularly for the contamination of the land. So it's a major issue in Glasgow. So that's me.
Thanks, Neil. Absolutely fascinating run through of how we got to where we were is probably a fair thing rather than where we are. But